Praise the Lord Jesus Christ. Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're taking an objective, really fascinating look at a highly structured sermon by Pastor Elvis. We're going to unpack the 7 distinct reasons why the Christian text considers Jesus to be entirely unique, or, as the sermon puts it, matchless. We're going to look directly at the scriptural claims that establish this whole premise and explore the logical progression of these arguments together.
So, to make sense of these 7 points without getting overwhelmed, we've logically grouped them into a 5-part journey. We'll be looking at 1. The matchless claim, 2. Miracles and ultimate authority, 3. Victory over death, 4. Friends, not servants, and finally, 5. The eternal promise.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the matchless claim.
Pastor Elvis grounds this very first claim in the ancient texts of the Old Testament Psalms and Isaiah, setting the stage for a figure who honestly defies all human comparison. He introduces the claim of absolute sinlessness. According to the sermon, Jesus openly challenged his harshest detractors with a simple yet incredibly bold question from John 8:46. Can any of you prove me guilty of sin? He stood right there before crowds and critics, essentially daring them to find a single flaw or moral failing, and the text records that no one could.
The sermon draws a pretty sharp contrast here. Think about human nature for a second. As cited in Romans 3:10, humanity is innately flawed, right? We're talking about childhood jealousy, small lies, intrinsic selfishness. Basically, none are righteous. But in stark contrast stands the theological claim about Jesus' nature from 2 Corinthians 5:21. The text asserts he was completely unknown to sin. He never experienced the guilt of a lie or the regret of a misdeed. This absolute, pristine purity is presented as the very first reason he is utterly unmatched.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, miracles and ultimate authority. This brings us to his unprecedented acts. The second reason centers entirely on the nature of his miracles. In John 9:32, it's highlighted that Jesus performed acts that literally hadn't been witnessed since the dawn of the world, like opening the eyes of a man born completely blind. This wasn't just framed as a healing, it was seen as an act of creation, a level of physical intervention that was entirely unique to him.
To really put this authority into perspective, Pastor Elvis walks us through the famous timeline of Lazarus. It's a key piece of evidence here. First, word arrives that Lazarus is dead. By the time Jesus actually acts, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 full days. Decay has already set in. Then, without any elaborate rituals or fanfare, Jesus simply commands him to come out. And finally, Lazarus emerges alive, still wrapped up in his grave clothes. This is presented as having ultimate, undeniable authority over life and death itself.
But here's the really wild part. It's how this authority was exercised. The sermon points out that when dealing with evil spirits, or storms, or even nature, Jesus didn't use spells or charms or any physical rituals. He just spoke. He commanded spirits and they obeyed. He literally rebuked a violent storm into absolute stillness. He even directed a specific fish with a coin in its mouth, right to Peter's hook. The sermon argues this direct, verbal command over all of creation is just entirely matchless.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 3, victory over death.
The third distinct claim we're looking at is that Jesus actually prophesied his own death and his subsequent resurrection. He publicly declared in Matthew 27:63, "After 3 days I will rise again." Now, this wasn't some kept secret. In fact, the text notes it was so widely known that political leaders literally posted armed guards at his tomb purely out of fear that his followers might try to fake it.
But the sermon doesn't just stop at the prophecy. It heavily relies on the physical proof of what happened next. The biblical text claims over 500 witnesses saw him alive at the same time. And he didn't just appear as some sort of ghost or spirit. He actively ate fish and bread right in front of them and even invited them to physically touch his wounds. Pastor Elvis argues that this tangible, documented bodily resurrection completely separates Jesus from any other religious figure in history. Building directly on that is a massive theological position, our fourth reason, that Jesus is the only individual to have descended from heaven, lived on earth, resurrected, and then been bodily taken back up into heaven while witnesses watched. Because of this, he acts as the sole, true, first-hand witness of God the Father. He isn't just guessing what heaven is like, He's actually reporting on his home.
Now let's shift gears a bit for Section 4. Friends, not servants.
Having established all this absolute power, the sermon pivots to look at how this figure actually treats his followers. Relying on a pivotal, really radical statement from John 15:15, "I no longer call you servants, I have called you friends."
Think about the ancient world, or even today, honestly. The dynamic between a supreme master and a follower is strictly hierarchical. Servants just take orders, but Jesus executes a total departure from this typical dynamic, elevating his followers to the status of friends.
Think about earthly gurus or masters for a second. They often keep their ultimate, final secrets totally to themselves, right? They maintain a strict hierarchy to preserve their own power at the top. But Jesus is presented as doing the exact opposite. He freely delegates his own authority, the power to heal, the power to cast out spirits, directly to his disciples. He doesn't hoard his power at all. He shares his full authority, basically elevating his followers to act on his level.
And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, the eternal promise.
The seventh and final claim we're looking at is all about complete, unbreakable spiritual security. John 10:28 offers this incredibly powerful assurance, "No one will snatch them out of my hand." The sermon explains this as a promise of absolute protection. It assures followers that absolutely no dark forces, no earthly enemies, not even death itself, can overcome a person held in his hand. The security he offers is eternal. Pastor Elvis summarizes this final point, wrapping up his case through the concept of the ultimate shepherd. Now, this is a shepherd who doesn't just guide his sheep, he voluntarily lays down his own life to save them. He promises to protect his followers even beyond the grave, ensuring they will never, ever be left or forsaken. This ultimate act of self-sacrifice is presented as the definitive, undeniable proof of his matchless love and his unmatched authority. Which brings us to a final thought to leave you with today. We've walked through a highly structured theological journey here, from absolute sinlessness and unprecedented miracles to victory over death, shared authority, and an eternal promise of protection. Having unpacked these 7 specific claims laid out in Pastor Elvis's sermon, how does this perspective change the way followers view spiritual authority today? I mean, if a figure holds this much literal power, yet chooses to call his followers friends and voluntarily lay down his life for them, how does that redefine what true leadership actually looks like? It is absolutely a fascinating question to ponder.